Welcome, students. This is Module 1.3.5, continuing in community ecology. One of the most interesting things about community ecology is that it studies the interactions between species. And that is our topic at this time, species interaction. So we can ask the question, how do species interact? And to answer that, in this class, we're going to address 6 basic types of interactions that species undergo. And so this is a table that shows species A and species B and the effect of one species on the other. Over here on the left is the name of the type of interaction. So the first interaction in this little table is called commensalism. In commensalism, species A benefits and species B is neither harmed nor benefited. A second interaction is mutualism. Mutualism is the proverbial win-win situation where species A is benefited by this presence of species B, and species B is also benefited by this presence of species A. A third interaction is parasitism. In parasitism, one individual, the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other, the host. A fourth interaction is competition. In competition, both species are harmed by the presence of the other. In predation, one species benefits, that is the predator, at the expense of the other, the prey, which is typically killed and eaten. The sixth and final interaction is called herbivory. Herbivory is much like predation, but in this interaction, one organism consumes plants and doesn't necessarily outright kill the plant. So that's how herbivory to some degree differs from predation. We're going to cover these 6 interactions, but not in the order they're given in this table. First, we're going to address competition. Competition is probably the most common interaction, depending on the particular situation that you're talking about. Competition involves 2 organisms attempting to use the same resource. This can be competition for food, or it can be competition for nest sites, or just competition for space, competition for territories, competition for shelter. But regardless of the exact nature of the competition, the result is that it reduces the fitness of both of the species involved in the interaction. There are at least 2 types of competition. One is interspecific competition. This is competition between members of different species. If you look at the prefix inter, I-N-T-E-R, that means between. And so interspecific means between species. So these are members of 2 different species. This is compared to the second type of competition that we're going to address here, and that is intraspecific competition. The prefix intra, I-N-T-R-A, means within. So within species competition. Intraspecific competition is competition between members of the same species. Now, I want you to do a little thought experiment and consider which type of competition would be more intense. Think about it for a moment. What do you think? What would be more intense? Well, if you're thinking intraspecific, that is competition between members of the same species, you would be correct, because members of the same species have the same adaptations and they use resources in exactly the same way, while members of different species, which would be involved in interspecific competition, they may have slight differences and slight differences in adaptation and use resources slightly differently, reducing the intensity of the competition. Now, an interesting thing is because competition is harmful to both species, it has been selected against by natural selection and evolution. And we can see this in the natural world to some extent. There was a Russian who did a study. His name was Gauss, and Gauss did a study, and his findings came to be known as the principle of competitive exclusion. And his conclusion from his experiment was simply that 2 species cannot occupy the same niche in the same place and the same time. Gauss did not work with wolves or lions or eagles. He worked with microscopic paramecia in the lab. And if you look at the top here, you can see that this is two different species. The red line is Paramecium aurelia, the green line is Paramecium caudatum. And if they're grown separately, both species survive. Now, if we look at the bottom graph, it's the same two species, but in this case, they're grown together. And in that case, one survives and one is extirpated or driven to local extinction. And from a number of these types of experiments, Gauss formulated the idea that became known as Gauss's principle, or the principle of competitive exclusion. Now, again, I was speaking earlier about how competition harms both species and how natural selection and evolution has shaped species to reduce that. And so how have some species reduced or avoided competition? Well, the answer to this question is by resource partitioning. This is when species evolutionarily developed traits that allow them to use the shared resources at different times or in different ways or in different places. Essentially, it is narrowing the niches of both species to reduce competitive overlap. A simplistic example is hawks and owls eat similar sized prey, but they hunt at different times. Hawks being diurnal are active in the day, and owls being nocturnal are active in the night. If we look at the predatory cats of Africa, we can see that lions take larger animals and leopards take smaller animals, rather than both being of similar size and taking the same size prey. A classical study of competitive exclusion was done by an ecologist named MacArthur, and MacArthur studied warblers that fed on the foliage. They're foliage gleaners. What they do is they go over the leaves and the branches of trees to look for small insects, and that's essentially, they're all in the same niche. But MacArthur, upon close inspection, found that they had, to some extent, divided up the resource. And you can see this figure shows 5 different species and it also shows the results of MacArthur's careful observations showing where they spent the majority of their time. And you can see that there is some division here. This is, again, resource partitioning, dividing up the niche. Resource partitioning niche is also called niche partitioning. Here's another example. These are 4 different species of lizards that live on a Caribbean island, and we can see that the drawing in the center shows the typical type of habitat that each of the 4 species occupies. Species A occupies the canopy of a palm tree. Species C occupies the trunk. Species D is down in the low vegetation. And species B is found in trees other than palm trees. And so it shows, again, this niche partitioning or resource partitioning among these lizards. Here is an example that you can observe locally. We can see a number of these wading birds just right down at the San Pedro River and other places. And this actually shows the lengths of the birds. This is beak to tail lengths, but it also corresponds to their leg lengths, with the tallest bird being at the left and the shortest at the right. And what this essentially does is it limits where they can hunt. I've seen a great blue heron, the tallest of these wading birds, up to its belly, almost to its neck. And it used its bill like a spear and stabbed right through a very large fish. Now, such a success in hunting would not be possible for a snowy egret or a black-crowned night heron or a green heron. None of them could have gotten to that water where that heron found that fish. And so we see. What is kind of interesting is we see the snowy egret and the black-crowned night heron are very similar in size. Of course, a clue is given in the name, and that is that the night heron hunts at night, and the egret hunts in the day. And so it's, again, dividing this up temporally, if you will. So we're going to conclude this module here, and we'll continue later.